Many people find joy in the great outdoors, embarking on adventures and returning home safely. Yet, there are times when trips end in unexplained disappearances shrouded in mystery. The following is based on a true story, where someone disappeared in a mysterious way. What happened to them is still unknown to this day. The story will be told from first-person perspective of the individual who vanished. While this tale is a work of fiction, could it be closer to the truth than we think? Certain details have been altered to respect the privacy of the family involved. I've always been a drifter, a wanderer, living life on the edge and making my own path. My name is Trevor, and I'm 29 years old, originally from the rolling hills of Tennessee. I've never been one to stick around in one place for too long, and I certainly don't fit into the conventional 9-to-5 mold. Instead, I've carved out a life for myself in the great outdoors, living off the grid, taking odd jobs here and there just to keep me going. My love for the outdoors runs deep. I've spent countless nights under the stars, deep in the heart of the wilderness, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. There's something about the solitude and simplicity of nature that calls to me. I've fished in secluded lakes, hunted in dense forest, and foraged for wild berries and mushrooms. I've built my own shelters from fallen branches and leaves, cooked meals over an open fire, and learned to navigate by the stars. The thrill of surviving on my own terms, relying on my own skills and instincts, that's what keeps me going. I pride myself on my ability to tackle any challenge head-on. If I set my mind to something, there's nothing that can stop me. So, when I decided to take a month off from everything and travel to Wisconsin to camp in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, I was beyond excited. This trip was going to be the ultimate test of my skills and endurance. I wanted to see if I could truly make it a month in the wilderness, living off the land and embracing the raw beauty of nature. I loaded up my white pickup truck with all the essentials: camping gear, fishing tackles, my wood whittling kit, and enough supplies to get me through the first week. As I drove north, leaving behind the familiar landscape of Tennessee, a sense of anticipation grew within me. The further I got, the more the scenery changed, becoming wilder and more untamed. By the time I reached Wisconsin, I was practically buzzing with excitement. Pulling into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness, I was immediately struck by the sheer beauty of the place. The vast expanse of forests, the sparkling lakes, and the rugged terrain took my breath away. I felt a deep sense of peace and contentment wash over me as I took in my surroundings. This was exactly where I was meant to be. The first week went exactly as planned. I found a perfect spot to set up camp. I'd spent my days fishing, exploring the area, and just being at peace. Each night, I'd sit by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the wilderness. I felt completely at home, at one with nature. But as the second week approached, I started feeling restless. I heard some of the locals talk about an area nearby that not many people visited. They spoke of it in hushed tones, warning of a local legend that claimed people who ventured there never returned. I laughed it off, not one to believe in silly superstitions. I craved the challenge and the thrill of exploring the unknown. Early one morning, I packed up my camp and loaded everything into the back of my truck. I drove to a small parking area close to this rumored spot and set off on foot, eager to find a new place to set up camp. I heard there was a decent-sized lake not too far from where this spot was supposed to be that offered a breathtaking view of the mountains, and I was determined to find it. After hiking for a few hours, I'd finally reached the lake. It was everything I'd imagined and more. The water was so clear it reflected the sky like a mirror, and the surrounding landscape was untouched and pristine. I felt a sense of awe as I looked around, knowing I'd found the perfect spot to spend the next few weeks. I set up my camp near the water's edge, arranging my gear and preparing for the night. As the sun began to set, I started a fire and took out my wood whittling kit. Whittling had always been one of my favorite hobbies. There was something incredibly soothing about shaping a piece of wood into something beautiful. I immediately stopped when I thought I heard something in the distance. It was brief, but there was definitely a sound, almost like a faint whistle. I paused, listening intently, but all I heard was the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, and continued whittling. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a distinct whistling sound. I looked around, trying to pinpoint the source, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I shrugged it off and didn't hear the whistle again. I yawned, and I figured it was time for me to go to bed. I wanted to secure my food for the night, so I tied a rope to my pack and I threw it over a high branch to keep it out of reach of any animals. Feeling satisfied that my supplies were safe, I climbed into my hammock and settled in for the night. The next morning, I woke up to the sun peeking over the mountain tops. It was the best way to wake up. I stretched and looked around my campsite, feeling a sense of peace and contentment. But then, I noticed something that sent a jolt of panic through me. My pack, the one I'd hung up in a high tree, was gone. Even the rope was missing. I searched the area, hoping it had simply fallen or been knocked down by an animal, but there was no sign of it anywhere. Frustrated and slightly worried, I tried to shake it off. I dealt with worse situations before, and I knew I could find a way to make do. Not wanting this to ruin my day, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed to the lake, determined to catch something to eat. As I walked along the shoreline, I spotted something in the distance in the water. As I walked closer, I finally realized what I was looking at. It was a family of beavers working hard on their dam. I couldn't help but smile at the sight, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. It reminded me of why I loved being out here, surrounded by the beauty and simplicity of nature. I took out my phone and snapped a picture, sending it to my family to share the moment with them. Even though they weren't physically here, it felt like they were a part of the experience. I decided not to disturb the beavers and walked further down the lake. I found a good spot to stop and I casted my line out into the lake. After about half an hour with no bites, I heard something behind me, a rustling in the trees. I glanced back, but saw nothing. I waited a moment, listening, but all was quiet again. Shrugging it off, I returned to my fishing. Then, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a rustling. It was a voice. A woman's voice. Faint, but unmistakably, calling out my name. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The voice called out again, and this time I could make out the words, "Over here." Confused and a little unnerved, I shouted back, "Hello?" but received no response. I strained to listen, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from, but the forest was eerily silent. I waited a few more minutes, but still nothing. I knew that there was no way anyone could know me out here. I was hundreds of miles away from my hometown, and not many people even knew I was out here. Then the thought hit me. This place was absolutely beautiful, and of course there are other people that must come to visit the spot, even if the locals say not to. Plus, Trevor isn't exactly an uncommon name. Surely some other hikers were out here, and one of them just happened to have the same name as me. Laughing at myself, I went back to my spot and continued fishing. After a few hours, I managed to catch a single fish. Enough for a meal, but not much more. As the sun began to set, I returned to camp to make dinner. I would be lying if I said a small part of my thoughts weren't still thinking about the voices from the woods. I knew deep down it was nothing, but I just still hadn't seen anyone. I just thought it was strange to keep hearing people, but never see them. That night, as I sat by the fire, I debated whether I should head to the supply store the next day. I prided myself on being self-sufficient, but the thought of running out of food was starting to weigh on me. I checked my map and saw there was a shop about 15 miles away. I didn't want the thought of giving in to get me down, but I wasn't an idiot either. I knew at the end of the day, pride could get me in a tough situation. Knowing I had a long hike back to the truck in the morning, I decided I should get some sleep. I climbed into my hammock and tried to go to sleep, but my mind wouldn't rest. I kept thinking about the missing pack, the voice in the woods, and that whistling. I began to wonder if they were related. Was someone messing with me? I tossed and turned for a while, but I did finally fall into a restless sleep. I don't know how long I was asleep, but I woke up covered in sweat and a feeling of dread washing over me. I looked over my hammock and it was still pitch black. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I thought maybe the fish I ate was bad or something, and it just made me sick. I climbed out of the hammock and made my way back to the lake for a drink of water. As I knelt by the water's edge, filling my bottle, I heard it again, the whistle. It was faint but unmistakable. It was definitely the same whistle from last night. I sat down in my chair, waiting for more sounds, but nothing. I couldn't figure out why someone was out there whistling. Were they messing with me? I sat in my chair for probably another hour on high alert. I started dozing off and thought it would be okay for me to head back to my hammock. I eventually passed out from exhaustion. The next day, I woke up to the sun peeking over the tops of the mountains once again. While this is normally something that brought me joy, I was still a little messed up from the events of the past few days. As I got ready to head to my truck, I turned around and looked at my camp. Part of me wanted to just pack my stuff up and leave. I looked out at the beauty of the lake and the mountain overlooking it. Then it hit me. I came out here to push myself to the limits. I wasn't about to let some fear of voices and whispering from unseen hikers scare me. I laughed out loud and shook my head. I told my camp that I'd be back in a while and walked to the woods towards my truck. A few hours later, I came across the dirt road that led to the lot where my truck was. I turned the corner, and there she was, my truck just as I left her. I walked up to the truck, hopped in the driver's seat, and made my way towards the shop. The route looked pretty simple. About 40 minutes later, I was pulling into a small parking lot of the shop. I went inside and grabbed a new pack and some basic supplies. I was actually surprised with how many people were there. I counted at least 8 different people, not including the 2 workers. This actually made me feel much more confident. It helped me realize that even though this was a small shop out in the middle of nowhere, there were still quite a bit of people here. Surely, all my strange experiences over the past few days were just hikers. I grabbed the rest of my supplies, checked out, and got back on the road. The route back seemed to go much quicker, and I was back in the lot before I knew it. I got my new pack, filled it with more than a week's supplies, and headed back down the trail to my camp. Back on the trail, it was the best I had felt since waking up the first morning at this location. I felt confident, and I wasn't going to let anything ruin this trip again. Finally, I could see the clearing that led to my camp. I smiled as I walked into the clearing as the mountain was there to greet me. But then, I stopped in my tracks. My heart stopped. What I was seeing couldn't be possible. I had to walk closer to my camp. But then I stopped, confirming what I was seeing. Next to my fire pit was my pack. The rope was laying neatly next to it. I just stood there, staring at it. All the confidence and excitement I had just built up disappeared. It suddenly became clear to me that the dread I had been feeling was right. Someone was here with me, and they didn't have good intentions. I knew I had to get out of there. I checked my watch for the time. I only knew I had 3 or 4 hours tops before sunset. It was going to be tough, but I knew I had to pack my camp and get back to my truck before sunset. I packed my stuff quicker than I'd ever had before, and I was back on the trail. I was practically running. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to be chasing me, but there wasn't. My heart was racing, and I had never been more scared in my life. With about 20 minutes of sunlight to spare, I had finally hit the dirt road that led to my truck. I threw everything in the passenger seat and sped out of there. I was probably driving way too fast for these roads, but I didn't care. I wanted to get as far away from this place as possible. The locals warned me about this place, and I ignored them. If they only knew it was a bunch of crazy people and not monsters out of a horror movie. I drove for about another 10 minutes when I noticed my truck was acting strange. I then saw my gas light was on. I was out of gas. But I knew I had well over half a tank left when I pulled into the lot just a few hours ago. I started to panic. Had those people done something to my truck? Were they trying to stop me from leaving? My thoughts were everywhere as my truck started stalling. I looked over to the side of the road looking for somewhere to pull over. Then, something was lit up by my truck headlights. It was a sign. It said, "Private property." I almost started crying for joy. Maybe someone lived here. The dirt road went back a little enough for me to pull in my truck. As I came to a stop, I could immediately see another small dirt road that head back into the woods. There was a small gate blocking the entrance. It actually looked like someone lived here. I pulled out my phone and realized I had no signal. Worse, I had 6% battery left. I knew I had 2 decisions: start walking down the road in the dark until I came to civilization, or go up this road and pray someone was there. I decided on the second option. I grabbed my pack and my flashlight that I kept in the truck and headed up the road towards what would hopefully be a house with a working phone. I walked for a little while. It was pitch black. The only reason I was able to see was because of my flashlight. While I was still terrified, I felt a little better as I was several miles away from that lake. They were surely far away from me, at least for the moment. I continued walking and finally came into a clearing. At first, I saw nothing but a small open field, but then I saw something in the middle. It was a house. Well, what used to be a house. It looked like it had been torn down for a while. Just the foundation was left. I pulled out my phone to see if I had service. I didn't. I dropped to my knees, feeling absolutely defeated and exhausted. I didn't know what to do. I looked at my watch. It was almost midnight. I knew there was no way I could find my way back to the shop in the dark. Even with my flashlight, I was only able to see a few feet in front of me. And honestly, I didn't want to go back down into that forest. I thought if I could just get through the night, I could head back down to the shop before sunset. I thought about laying next to the torn down foundation of that house. However, the thought hit me that if I stayed here, and these people were after me, they would find me pretty easily out here in the open. I thought maybe I should just go a little into the woods, just out of sight. Maybe I'd be safer that way. As much as I didn't want to go back into the woods, I knew that a little shelter would at least make me feel a little safer. I walked to the side of the tree line and walked in. I only went back about 50 feet. I didn't want to be too far from the opening so that I could easily find it again in the morning. I found 2 trees that would work perfect with my hammock and quietly set it up. I ran a tarp over the hammock. I think I felt more secure with something over me. I set my pack on the ground, and I pulled my gun out of the bag and took it into the hammock with me. I slowly sunk into the hammock, trying to be as quiet as possible. I kept telling myself no one would find me here, but I just had this overwhelming feeling of dread. I clipped my holster on the rope that was holding up my tarp right above my head. I prayed I wouldn't need it, but if I did, it would be easy to grab. I laid there for a while, and it felt like a lifetime. The forest was completely quiet. I didn't even hear crickets chirping. I took a deep breath and knew I needed to get some rest for what would hopefully be my final hike tomorrow morning. I forced my eyes closed, hoping sleep would find me soon. However, just as I was about to drift away, I heard a familiar sound. It was the whistle. Had they found me? I didn't move a muscle, trying to see if my mind was playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. I heard the whistle again. It sounded really close to my tent. Then, I heard a voice. It was the same woman's voice I had heard in the woods. She was calling my name. My entire body was paralyzed with fear. I was fighting the urge to scream and run, hoping they hadn't found me. Then, the voice called my name again, and it was right outside my hammock. Still paralyzed, I looked up at my gun. Every instinct was telling me to grab it, but I couldn't. It was like I was frozen in time, like my body was no longer in my control. I then heard loud steps, the sounds of twigs and branches snapping with each heavy step. It was so dark, I couldn't see anything. Then there was a slight orange glow coming from the gap between the top of my hammock and the tarp. I moved my eyes over, looking out. I realized it wasn't just one light, but 2, and they were orange. I tried to figure out what I was looking at. Then, they blinked. The realization hit me of exactly what I was looking at. They were eyes. The only thing I could do was stare at them. Then, a head slowly peered over my hammock and looked right at me. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. It looked like rotting flesh was hanging off their face. They had sharp, mangled teeth. But the eyes were the most horrifying thing. Those bright, orange eyes.